Hello everyone! Today, I'm going over a budget commander deck that I've brewed around Matoya, Archon Elder. As usual, I've designed this deck to list for less than $45 at the time of recording, using prices listed by Scry, including our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price this doesn't include costs such as shipping. So, Matoya, Archon Elder, is a 1/4 legendary human warlock costing 2 and a blue to cast, and has it so whenever you scry or surveil, you draw a card, after you finish scrying or surveiling. Which on the face of it is a great value engine, letting us filter through and clean up the top of our library, and draw a ton when building around scrying and surveilling, but with few exceptions, fiddling with the top of our deck and drawing don't typically push the game towards the end on its own. So, for this deck, as you've probably guessed, we're going to focus pretty heavily on sources of scrying and surveilling to both act as draw sources and as ways for us to dig through our deck for the cards that we could find most useful at a given point in the game. And for that we have a fairly wide range of when a scry or surveil ability triggers in the game, with enter the battlefield effects mostly being on lands, triggers when a creature attacks, triggers on our upkeep, permanents that we can tap to scry or surveil, and of course, non-permanent spells that have a scry or surveil as either a primary or secondary effect, which for the most part should keep our hands quite full. However, we'll also be looking to have a bunch of sources of creature tokens that trigger whenever we draw a second card in a turn to help us widen our board. And we'll be looking to trigger this as frequently as possible on our opponent's turns, partially through our tapping effects, but also considering cantrips like Opt, which on its own has you scry one and draw a card, but Matoya will have you draw a second card due to that scry, which when combined actually makes us a fairly turn creature sideways type deck, despite the commander not really reading like that, or at least it didn't for me on first read. But let's move on to the 99 of this deck, starting with our ramp, which I've actually kept a little bit lower than my typical deck, as this has a comparatively low number of 4+ mana spells, and ramping will rarely help us get Matoya out a turn early, but we still have Arcane Signet to tap for blue, and Mind Stone tapping for generic, but could be sacked later on for even more draw. Thought Vessel and Decanter of Endless Water, which tap for generic and blue respectively, but both give us no max hand size, which is an effect that's heavily welcomed in this deck. Sonic Screwdriver can be tapped for blue, but can also be used to scry, or make one of our creatures unblockable for a turn. Sapphire Medallion is a cost reducer for the vast majority of our spells. And finally, a bit of an odd one, Pew Pew UFO, a 2-drop 0/4 with flying that we can tap to put a land card from our hand onto the battlefield, which is mostly here due to how often I found myself having an abundance of lands in hand before long, despite being able to clean the top of your deck before you do a lot of your drawing. But with that, let's move on and take a look at a large proportion of the sources of scrying and surveilling in this deck. Starting with Cryptic Annelid, which, when it enters, has you first scry 1, then scry 2, and then scry 3, which amounts to a pretty hefty amount of draw with Matoya on the board for a single creature entering the battlefield. And following up with Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, which has you scry 1 whenever Elrond or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, and if it's the second time that happens in a turn, the ring tempts you, which has a laundry list of effects. Then we have Ilmeg Pixie and Night Veil Sprite, flyers which have a surveil 1 when they attack, Moonfolk Puzzlemaker, which has you scry 1 when it's tapped, though swinging with it is the only way to tap it without an effect from another card. And Aqueous Form is an aura making its enchanted creature unblockable, and you scry 1 whenever the enchanted creature attacks. Mind Whisker and Search for Azcantia have you surveil 1 at the beginning of your upkeep, and both have an effect starting if you have 7 or more cards in your library, with Mind Whisker giving your opponent's creatures -1 power, and Search for Azcantia can be turned into the land Azcantia, the Sunken Ruin. Though, for Search for Azcantia, it's good to note that the front side has been eroded to say Surveil 1, but this isn't the case for Azcantia, the Sunken Ruin's non-mana ability, so you might not always want to transform it immediately. Then Geist of the Archives and Thassa, God of the Sea, have you scry 1 at the beginning of your upkeep, with Thassa also having the ability to make a creature we control unblockable for the turn. Sigiled Starfish can simply be tapped to scry 1, while Rune Sealed Wall can be tapped to surveil 2. And for 2 mana, Coastal Bulwark can also be tapped to surveil 1. While almost always being a 3/3 defender, as we have a ton of basic islands in this deck. Mazemind Tome can be tapped to put a page counter on it and then scry 1, though you exile the artifact when there's 4 or more page counters on it and you gain 4 life. And Crystal Ball can be tapped with 1 mana to scry 2. And Oracle's Insight is an aura that lets a creature be tapped to scry 1 and then draw a card, an easy way for us to get 2 draws on an opponent's turn. And then wrapping up the section with some non-permanent spells, Opt has you scry 1 and then draw a card. Consider and Dreams of Laguna have you surveil 1 and then draw a card, though Dreams of Laguna also has flashback to cast it later on. Curate has you surveil 2 and then draw 1. Deliberate has you scry 2 and then draw 1. And finally, Mission Briefing has you surveil 2 and then choose an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard which you can cast this turn, though that spell gets exiled if it were to go into your graveyard after. But now let's go over the spells that can help us to get a much wider board state. Starting with Emrakul's Messenger, a 2-drop flyer that makes 0/1 Eldrazi spawn creature tokens that you can sack to produce 1 generic mana whenever you draw your second card on a given turn. Mischievous Mystic makes a 1/1 flying blue fairy on your second draw on a turn, while Thopter Fabricator makes a 1/1 flying Thopter also when you draw your second card each turn. I'm going to be repeating myself a lot here. Ethereal Investigator investigates X times when it enters, with X being the number of opponents you have, and then it makes a 1/1 flying white spirit creature token whenever you draw your second card each turn. Alondra, Sky Dreamer, has you make a 2/2 flying blue drake whenever you draw your second card each turn, but when you draw your 5th card each turn, Alondra and your drakes get +X for the turn, with X being the number of cards in your hand. Detective of the Month makes a 2/2 white-blue detective when you draw your second card each turn, though it also has Ascend, giving you the City's Blessing for the rest of the game if you control 10 or more permanents, and then if you have the City's Blessing, your detectives can't be blocked. Min, Wily Illusionist, makes a 1/1 blue illusion creature token whenever you draw your second card each turn, with those illusions getting +1 power for each other illusion you control. And whenever an illusion you control dies, you can put a permanent with mana value equal to or less than that creature's power from your hand onto the battlefield. And finally, for the effects triggering on your second draw each turn, Homunculus Horde makes a copy of itself whenever you draw your second card each turn, so it's kinda like a blue Scute Swarm. Then we have Ominous Seas, which gets a Foreshadow counter on it whenever you draw a card, and you can remove 8 of those counters to make an 8/8 Kraken creature token. Chasm Skulker gets a +1/+1 counter whenever you draw a card, but when it dies, it makes X 1/1 blue squid creature tokens with Island Walk, with X being the number of +1/+1 counters on Chasm Skulker. And finally, Hermes, Overseer of Elpis, makes a 1/1 blue bird creature token with flying whenever you cast a non-creature spell, and has you scry 2 whenever you attack with 1 or more birds. But with that, I'd like to go over a few other synergistic pieces that didn't fit smoothly into the other chapters. Starting with Psychosis Crawler, one of the few ways that we can directly turn our draw into opponent life loss. Kalinquid Sky Mage and a Neurophage are flyers that get a +1/+1 counter whenever you draw a card, and then Wizard Class immediately gives you no max hand size, but can be leveled up to first have you draw 2 cards, and the second level up makes it so whenever you draw a card, you put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control. Proph's Eidetic Memory has you draw upon it entering, gives you no max hand size, and then at the beginning of combat on your turn, you put X +1/+1 counters on a target creature you control, with X being the number of cards you've drawn that turn, -1. And I'll wrap up this section with a couple of alternate win cons, with Triskaidekaphile giving you no max hand size, a way to draw, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you win the game if you have exactly 13 cards in your hand, while 20-Toed Toad gives you a max hand size of 20, and whenever you attack with 2 or more creatures, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Toad, and you draw a card. And then when the Toad attacks, you win the game if you have 20 or more counters on it, or if you have 20 or more cards in hand. But now let's move on to our various sources of interaction. Starting with counterspells, we have Counterspell to simply counter a spell, Dissolve countering a spell and then having you scry 1, Sinister Sabotage countering a spell and then having you surveil 1, Swallowed by Leviathan having you choose a target spell, then you surveil 2, and then you counter the chosen spell unless the controller pays 1 mana for each card in your graveyard. And Bane's Contingency counters a spell, but if that spell was targeting our commander, we counter that spell, scry 2, and then draw a card. Then moving off from counterspells, Rapid Hybridization lets us destroy a target creature, though his controller gets a 3/3 green frog lizard creature token in return. Hithlane Knots lets you tap down a target creature, then you scry 1 and draw a card. Impede Momentum and Freeze in Place have you tap a creature and put 3 stun counters on it, then the former has you scry 1 and the latter scry 2. Elvish Mariner has you scry 1 whenever it attacks, but whenever you scry, you tap up to X target non-land permanents, with X being the number of cards you looked at while scrying. Unauthorized Exit bounces a target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then you surveil 1. And Afara's Dispersal bounces a creature to its owner's hand, and you surveil 2, with that spell costing 2 less if it targets an attacking creature. Voyage's End bounces a creature to its owner's hand, and you scry 1. And Aetherize bounces all attacking creatures to their owner's hand. And finally, since I didn't really know where to place this, we have Psychic Impetus, enchanting a creature, goading it, giving a +2/+2, and whenever that creature attacks, we scry 1. But now that we've gone through all the spells in this deck, let's move on to our land base. Starting with Myriad Landscape, which can act as a bit of ramp, tutoring 2 basic lands of the same type onto the battlefield tapped. Reliquary Tower gives us no max hand size, and then Zephyr Void, Crystal Grotto, and the Grey Havens have you scry 1 when they enter. Hidden Grotto, Gallifrey Council Chamber, and Conduit Pylons have you surveil 1 when they enter the battlefield, and Path of Ancestry will tap for blue, and when we cast a creature sharing a creature type with our commander with mana produced from it, we Scry 1. Rivendell and Castle Vantress can be tapped with mana to Scry 2, and Tokasia's Dig Site can also be used to Surveil 1. But aside from that, we'll fill the rest of this deck with 25 basic islands. But now that we've gone through all 100 cards in this deck, let's take a look at that price. And as you can see here, this deck is currently listing for around $44.50 at the time of recording, which does include our basic lands at 10 cents each, but as a list price, it doesn't include costs such as shipping. And before closing out this video, I'd like to suggest a few other cards you may wish to consider when building this deck. The Water Crystal can give you some more cost reduction, but would actually be even better if you decide to lean into a mill aspect of Matoya, but I just didn't really want to lean into that for this build. You can get some more cost reduction with Jace's Sanctum, though it only would affect about 19 cards in this deck currently. And you could add Walking Atlas, which would do similar to Pew Pew UFO. For an alternate counterspell, you could use an Offer You Can't Refuse as a good 1-drop counterspell, though that doesn't have any Scry or Surveil. And if you find you want more creature destruction, there's always Pongify. You could use Mystic Speculation due to buyback, though at sorcery speed it won't help you trigger most of your creature token generation sources on opponent's turns. This is also why I don't have Serum Visions, for example. And Toothy, Imaginary Friend, is another creature that grows whenever you draw a card, and when it leaves the battlefield, you get to draw even more. Teferi's Ageless Insight just gives you straight up more draw outside of your first draw each turn. And Mystic Sanctuary can potentially let you get one of those instant and sorcery cards back from the graveyard. And the last suggestion I'm going to make is Propaganda, making it a lot more expensive for your opponents to swing at us. But regardless, if you want to build, adapt, upgrade, or otherwise play with this deck, the link, as always, is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider dropping a like, and maybe drop the channel a sub if you want a bit more of this kind of content in your feeds. But anyway, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.